I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a delight to welcome you all here for this conference today, Going Forward, Planning the Region's Transportation Future in a Time of Crisis. Before we get underway, I have to say just once again, this conference has been made possible by not only the financial support, but also just the vision of our partners in this, led by Howard Amundsen and the Fieldstead Foundation, Fieldstead and Company. And so if you please join me in thanking Howard for his support. This conference was planned about 6 or 8 months ago, and a lot has happened in the last 6 or 8 months. And so I also just want to take a moment to thank all of the participants, including our kickoff keynoter, Richard Florida. We had originally planned this to be a conference about transportation planning and its intersection and sometimes conflict with human flourishing. That is still a theme that you're going to hear throughout the panels. But in light of the events of these last couple months, I'm sure you understand why we had to do a little flexing on the topics, and I want to thank and salute all of the panels and our keynote speaker to be able to think differently about the upcoming and current conference that we are going to host for you here. The fact that we've experienced these fires in the last month and a half is something that's uniquely important to Pepperdine. Some of you know that actually not these recent fires, but the ones in December. The Franklin fire in particular was one that threatened our campus in Malibu. We happen to be the policy school closest to the fires that have transpired here. And I'm sure, as with many of you, we all know people who have been deeply impacted, and maybe some of you have been directly impacted by these fires. And of course, related to that is an ongoing conversation about where we build and how we build. And that is certainly going to be a conversation here. It strikes directly to the questions that Pepperdine asked when it built the Malibu campus in the late 60s and early 70s. Some of you remember 2018, the Woolsey fire that came down from north to south and also threatened our Malibu campus. A lot of stories were written there then about why Pepperdine built where it did and how it did, and understood that there was really some resilience built in from the very beginning, starting with the architect and designer of the campus, William Pereira. I thought that as a way of leading into this series of conversations, I draw from a piece that was written in LA Curbed after the Woolsey fire that really went into how important the factor of fires and their presence in Southern California were to the design of campus. And again, not just for the buildings, what they were built with and how they were designed, but really even how the site was laid out for that Malibu campus. And so some may not know that Pereira and his engagement by Pepperdine actually started in 1965. The family that owned much of what is now the city of Malibu, the Adamson family, and some of you, if you're familiar, know that there remains an Adamson house that is a state park facility. If you have not been there, right by the Malibu Pier, I strongly encourage it. It's a great insight into Malibu and even Southern California of the past. The Adamson family actually engaged William Pereira to develop a master plan for the city of Malibu, or then the town of Malibu itself. And I wanted to read this because it strikes to some of the issues that we're going to be exploring here. Frankly, the first plan that William Pereira developed was one that was accepted by the Adamsons, but for the other property owners, it was quickly shelved and has rarely been seen since. So I'm going to quote from this article. Pereira had been commissioned in 1965 to create a master plan for Malibu by Merritt Huntley Adamson, Jr., whose family owned much of Malibu, including the 138 acres that Adamsons gifted to Pepperdine. The plan was never made public perhaps because Pereira's idea, quote, clusters off houses set off by huge natural preserves, unquote, would have put the housing much closer together and left more of the land undisturbed. The opportunity to work on Pepperdine's new campus gave Pereira a chance to revisit this idea. One of the things you may not know about the design of the Pepperdine campus is, although it is in around 800 acres, a very small part of those 800 acres are actually used for the buildings, the classrooms, the dorm space that is really what is the Pepperdine campus. And of course, that was taken from Pereira's idea that if you're going to be working in places which are prone to fire, you have to think about those things, not only in your building materials, but even where you site houses. And that, of course, is why the original master plan for the city of Malibu was never seen again. One wonders now that we are confronted with the rebuilding process for this region and area, including Malibu, and as someone who has driven Pacific Coast Highway now twice in the last 4 days, I can say the damage and the destruction is utterly breathtaking. And obviously we are going to be considering that factor very much in the panels ahead. The agenda that you see for this gathering you all have received, and it's in your folder. We're going to begin with a keynote by Richard Florida, and then go into a series of break for lunch, and then go into a series of 3 panels. And then we're going to close with some remarks. This also wasn't planned, but my friend Wade Graham, who's a historian and has been working on an LA County almanac and a project for the Huntington Library in Pasadena, has written some recent pieces about the history of fire in Los Angeles County. And I thought, not to end on a depressing note, but at least to acknowledge that we are living and working, especially for those of us tasked with planning and building, in a very unique and uniquely beautiful place. But with that come trade-offs. The School of Public Policy was founded by the late great social scientist James Q. Wilson, as some of you know, and he was very famous for teaching our students, especially in our first few years, about the importance of trade-offs. California is not famous for being able to make trade-offs, and we are going to be confronted with those here in the days, weeks, and months ahead. And I'm very much hoping that we can be seen at the Policy School as a convener of conversations that understand the important policy questions without putting our own finger on the scale, to convene conversations like this, both for here, and I know obviously as we're videotaping this, for others that are going to be viewing this in the days, weeks, and months ahead. So let's get into our agenda. I wanted to welcome here for our opening keynote Richard Florida. And again, just for some logistics, Richard's going to give comments for about 30 minutes and then engage us all in some Q&A. He definitely welcomes the opportunity to hear from you and engage in conversation. Richard, as you know, is one of the world's leading urbanists and international best-selling author of The Rise of the Creative Class. He is a visiting professor at Vanderbilt, which I understand is a university in Nashville, and a university professor at the University of Toronto, and serves at the Kresge Foundation as a visiting fellow. He's taught in a variety of different colleges and universities, and again brings this unique perspective as not only a visionary urbanist, but also someone who engages directly with policy students, planning students, and architecture students in preparing the next generation. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Richard Florida.
Thank you, Pete. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. I love this city. If you're an American, especially an American of my generation, you cannot but love Los Angeles. I mean, I was a hippie, sorry. I thought I was going to be a guitar player. That explains me, if you think that. I was a hippie who thought I was going to be a guitar player. Never thought of myself, I never said that before, but, if you think about that, California, in Southern California, defined the touchstones of my life. And as a very low-income kid, the son of working-class parents, Italian America, growing up in Newark, New Jersey, it just looked like nirvana. And I always tell my wife, I told her last night, I FaceTimed her and said, I love this place and someday we need to live here. It's the only place, and I'm being honest with you, that when we talk about where we'd move our family, we would move. Sitting on the plane yesterday, flying from Nashville, the guy next to me in business class, this lovely fellow. We started talking. He lost his home in Altadena. Really interesting guy. He came from a family of musicians. He was a musician, a singer-songwriter. Had a very interesting career, an LA kind of career, writing music for ABC. And pivoted and has now, and we found lots to work on together, is a leadership coach working with executives in the medical community and in the kind of digital creator community, and really thinking long and hard about education and professional education. But he and his wife were there, and they were so committed. I mean, I just thought about it. Could I do that? He went to the store and bought a new guitar. I don't know if I could even done that. And so committed, he has plans drawn up for his new house. He hired not only an architect, but a contractor in Nebraska. Pretty smart, actually, to hire a contractor from Nebraska, and got a good rate. Look, LA will come back. All of this nonsense that we heard after COVID, that cities were dead, cities won't come back, New York was finished, but London, I wish people could hold these bozos to account. I wrote in March of 2020, actually it was published a little bit later, New York will come back, London will come back, history is littered with this nonsense. Great cities do not fall because of infectious pandemics or because of natural disasters. In fact, if you read the historical record, and during COVID, what else could I do? I'd sit in my PJs and read the historical. It's so nice to put on. Thank you for letting me put on a suit, Pete. Get out of my gym. My kids are like, do you only wear pajamas? I'm like, no, that's James Purse stuff from Southern California. That's clothes. They're like, but it looks like you're always in your pajamas, Dad. Anyway, look, I went back and read the historical record pretty closely. I also worked at the University of Toronto very closely with a fellow named Chris Kennedy, who wrote the most important book on natural disasters in cities. It was published by the University of Toronto Press. It's not easily readable. It was not a bestseller. But cities are civilization's greatest creation. We know that. And what happens is they tend to bounce back, especially if they're large dynamic cities with assets, from disasters better than before. That disasters, I hate to say there's a silver lining because it doesn't sound right, but they create certain preconditions. They cause people to wake up. They cause people to overcome political differences. They cause you to think about infrastructure in a new way. And really what the asset of a city is, I mean, don't get me wrong, natural beauty matters. Having a coastline really matters. But it's not so much the built environment, it's the ability of talented and creative people to cluster in them that matters. So rebuilding Los Angeles is way more than about rebuilding structures. It's about the people, the connections, the social life that's here. And I think, if I think about it, it's not only the fires, it's the Olympics. You have to do a lot more than replace what was lost. You have the opportunity to reset yourself for a whole new round of growth. And while fires and natural disasters are painful in the short run, they can be dispersed, this kind of rebuilding in the long run. Now, you can look at the record. Rome in 64 AD, London in 1666, that Chris writes very eloquently about, Chicago in 1871, the San Francisco earthquake. In each case, folks, even though these disasters were painful in the short run, they led to incredible advances in building technology. I was watching the news this morning, and I don't know if you saw the guy who had the house on a stilt that goes into the ground. I mean, this was on your local news, on Fox News this morning, all talking about building, and makes sense, we're in California, right? All these advances in, well, this is very typical what happens after a disaster. People then think about how do we create more fire retardant, and some of it's very rudimentary, you know, in Rome in 64, in London in 1666, in Chicago, of course, the use of steel frame construction and other technologies. But not just advances in building technologies, advances in firefighting techniques. They talked about that on the news today. They were talking about how to use different drone technology and how people can't, I mean, it was just incredible, like reading the record over the past week and listening today. All sorts of new firefighting techniques, the invention of modern fire brigades, the invention of modern fire departments, but of course, massive inventions in how we build in an urban design, the reform of building codes, zoning codes, the development of new ways of constructing wider streets, and better government, and two things California has been challenged by, especially from some of our friends who are more conservative, arguing that California, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I don't want to make a value judgment, that California had something of a governance crisis, and in each and every one of these cases, if you read the historical record, they too, there was this thought, and they adapted to that. They created new mechanisms of governments, new ways of streamlining, rebuilding. And then, of course, you know, you have the Olympics coming. And what do we know about Olympics? I tell a story about my great friend Dan Doctoroff, who was deputy mayor of New York, and then invented Sidewalk Labs, and then was run out of Toronto. Canadians sometimes don't like Americans. That's a story for another time. And I said, I was not predisposed to like Dan, because he wanted to knock down a lot of the west side of Manhattan and put up stadiums and do the Olympics. And we met, and I love the guy. And he explained to me, Rich, it isn't about knocking down things, it's about rebuilding cities in new ways. And when you have something like the Olympics, you can build all sorts of infrastructure, you can do all sorts of things you wouldn't otherwise do. And I thought it was quite, I never thought about it that way. But if you look at this city, the last time you had the Olympics, if you look at Barcelona, not all cities have benefited from this. Some cities have punted. You look at Barcelona in 1992. You look at, and I'm doing a lot of work, and it's actually quite controversial in Toronto, because Toronto has a very large, if you think you have NIMBYs here, come to Toronto. You can't, I mean, anyway, I'm doing a big project on the waterfront in Toronto, and why we need a more dynamic waterfront. Well, you look at the waterfront in London. That's what got done. You know, they made a massive effort to make London a much more exciting and appealing place, particularly in East London. So you have a unique opportunity here. And here's what I think is the thesis. And I'm planning to do much more here. I'm working with several developers in downtown. Here's what I think, and here's what I think is a framework to think about. This place was so darned attractive. I mean, I never got here. I'm a pretty capable person. I never found a way to get myself here. So that means it's hard to get here. It's not easy to get here. I think in California and LA, you developed, maybe you didn't even think about it, regulations, policies, and environment that was designed to keep people out. I sort of mumbled that, and I saw some nods. Thank you for giving me encouragement. You know, I don't know exactly what they were, but you have Nirvana. It's beautiful. The climate's great. You're near the water. You're near mountains. Keep these other people, especially from the East Coast, these bozos, out. We have already seen the limits of that before COVID, and then with COVID, driven by affordability, congestion, challenges to lifestyle. Some people are governance, maybe a place that was seen as having too much of one opinion. And now the combination of COVID and what happened here in the fires have shown that that's over. The time has come for you to develop a framework and a policy to bring people in. And that's a big shift, because you're not like a Sunbelt boomtown, like the place I live, part of the year, Miami Beach or North Carolina or Texas. You're California. But I think thinking about that in a robust way is super interesting. And here's why I think you have so many assets. You know me if you've read my work. I've written about this incredible transformation that we're going through, and that makes sense as a kid of a factory worker who saw his dad working in a factory, who visited his dad's factory, then confronted with this massive shift in society, culture, California, counterculture, hippies, Laurel Canyon, the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and then seeing this was really about the rise of the knowledge and innovation and creative economy, where it's no longer so much that manufacturing and physical labor and physical resources drive the economy, but human creative capabilities. So, you know, if you just enumerate Los Angeles' assets, well, and if you think just in terms of the transformation, you know, less than 10% of Americans worked in these creative or knowledge-based fields at the turn of the last century: science, technology, innovation, management, business, public policy, education, healthcare, arts, design. You know, that grew to 15% in 1950, 20% by 1980. Now it's 40%. And by the way, if you aggregate these occupations, people who work in the creative and knowledge-based occupations are the single largest group, class, if you will, in our economy. They've surpassed the routine service workers, more than double the amount of people who work in blue-collar jobs like my dad. Los Angeles has 2.7 million of these folks, 41% of your workforce. Now, despite the claims, and I'm probably going to write a book on this, despite the claims that the digital world and the rise of the internet and Zoom technology would somehow flatten us and lead to the end of geography, conquer distance, and cause cities to collapse, if you look at innovation, innovation is more clustered, concentrated, and spiky than ever. Just 3 broad regions in the United States: the Bay Area, the Acela Corridor — congratulations on your new public policy program or school in Washington, D.C. — Boston, New York, Washington corridor, and this place, Southern California, account for 80% of all venture capital investment. Greater LA has about $12 billion a year. That's 4th in the nation behind the Bay Area, New York, and Boston. And if you look at the data like I do, there are only 2 places — it's not Miami, it's not Austin, it's not Seattle — that have increased share. They have increased their amount, but their share has stayed the same, 1 or 2%. 2 places have increased share against the Bay Area: Los Angeles and New York. Even Peter Thiel — I actually was in a study group with Peter Thiel. We read Henry George with Tyler Cowen. You love this, don't you? It was incredible. You know, I think everyone should read Henry George, and I think Henry George is more important than reading Marx. We can come back to that at the end if you want. But Peter Thiel, who has said it's impossible to abandon the human innovation infrastructure of Southern and Northern California. I've just completed a massive study supported by Meta of the digital creator economy. When they called me and asked me to study the creators, I'm like, I'm like, who? I said, do you want me to study the kids my kids watch making toys on YouTube? Like, why would I do that? And like, no, you know, Rich, you studied the creative class. Just take a look. They're being very nice to me. So I went and looked, and we did 2 studies. I kind of reviewed and there was no literature. It was all really haphazardly done consulting work. It was not awful. Then we just finished a big survey. We surveyed with the folks at Meta, their research team, my research team, and then a group of a global survey firm based in Europe called FactWorks. We surveyed 10,000 creators across the world, came up with the first decent estimates of how many they are, what they do. That's fascinating, but I don't want to go into all of that. The point is, LA is at the center of this thing. LA is the most important place in the universe, and if you think about it, this is critical. The rise of these digital platforms — I always say this in Nashville — I love the singer-songwriters. I wish I could be one. I love playing vintage musical instruments, but we are going to get destroyed because we don't understand the shift to these digital platforms. LA is at the very center of — my seatmate told me about Playa Vista. I had no clue what was going on there in terms of YouTube and Google and all of the stuff and the infrastructure and Netflix and all this stuff that's going on here, which I didn't know about. But LA and New York are far and away the major centers for digital creators in the world. But what's interesting is LA has the largest number of digital creator economy startups, larger than San Francisco. And it's second in it. San Francisco has a little bit more investment. They're bigger startups, so second. You are so well positioned in this. And then, of course, the creative economy or the new economy or the knowledge economy, it's just important to say, is fundamentally organized around space or location And the way I like to say this when I speak is if the city itself, or the urban agglomeration, or the metropolitan area, whatever word you want to use for it, has become the fundamental platform of economic and social life, and the fundamental platform of our identity. People very seldom ask me what I do anymore. The first thing they do is ask me where I live. If I think about my identity is bound up in where I live. If I think about friends like Bill Bishop, who wrote a book like The Bill Sort, our cultural, political, social, but it's like what the farm was to the agricultural age, and what the industrial corporation and the large-scale factory was to the industrial age. Platforms connecting people to work and connecting human talent to making things. That's what the city is, or this thing we call an agglomeration, or an external economy to space. And LA, I think, defines elements of that new geography in very powerful ways. I've learned that from people like Joel Kotkin or Mike Storper. Two very different people, right? Two of my best friends. And that I was resistant to this, that these polycentric form spread out. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Newark. New York City was my reference. I was caught in that mindset, which is very urbanist-like, that a metropolitan area is a city with a single core and people get on rails and commute. No. In fact, what digital technology does is really disrupt. Now, look, that's been being disrupted for a long time. LA exists, Sunbelt cities exist. But I was just talking to some of my friends who work on downtowns, and they're older. They're like, how could you be so dumb? We've all known that the world was going to polycentrism. And what's happening, I think, is that downtowns, I'll talk about that in a minute, are morphing and changing and becoming more livable as well as commercial. And that external areas that we used to call the suburbs, and I really think what we're grappling with post-COVID is we have terrible terms. Urban, suburban, they don't work. Like I'm working with folks in the Woodlands in Texas, with Howard Hughes Corporation, trying to reinvent what suburbia is. And I said, we have to reinvent the suburbs, and they say, we hate that word. Give us a new word. And I'm like, I don't have one. I think, and it's not 15-minute neighborhoods with everyone just living and working and going to the store together. And I'm lucky in Toronto, my kids can walk to school and there is a store and there is a place to get a sandwich. Yeah, that's great. But no, cities are more than that. I think what people are struggling, over the course of the Industrial Revolution, we separated the places we always lived and worked in the same place. And over the course of the Industrial Revolution, we pulled that apart. And we developed technologies that allow us to settle, right? First in walking cities, then in horse car cities, streetcar cities, auto cities, and now Los Angeles. But now we're seeking to reintegrate those. And the way we reintegrate those is, of course, some of us like to live in a one-minute city called a big house with 2 home offices, a playroom, a big backyard. You never leave it. You get everything delivered by Uber. But I think people are trying to I think LA is at the center of this. Reconfiguring your lives in urban centers relatively close to where you live that are polycentric, and sometimes you move between them. Polycentrism, I think, is a very important. All of this, of course, is enabled by remote work. I don't have to go into that very much. It tripled during the pandemic from about less than 5% of people doing remote work from home to nearly 20%. 25% of days are work from home right now. 33% of days are work from home in large cities. Downtowns are changing, and I'd be remiss. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but look where we are. The Central Business District is the last gasp of the Industrial Revolution. The factory was the first. There was a reason to pack and stack knowledge workers in large vertical towers, because you were tethered to your desk. I remember when I'm old enough as a professor, there was a phone. It wasn't the rotary, it was a push button, big advance. And my computer had a hard wire. It was an 086 machine. We had a clunky email. And my secretary, sorry for the gender term, would bring me the pink little things with my calls. I couldn't work. There was no place else I could work. I had to work. I was tethered. And we passed information very physically. We handed it to one another. And I remember going to Carnegie Mellon in 1987. This guy comes in. His name is Raj Reddy. He's like, you know what? We're going to invent this technology called the internet, which enables us to work anywhere, anytime, any place. And I said, you're nuts. I just said, you're crazy. You're insane. Well, welcome to the 21st century. So as that happened, as we became untethered, and if you read the history of downtowns, Robert Sogelson's magistral history of it, downtown, its rise and fall, 1880 to 1950. Fogelson thought downtown was over in 1950. My own take on this is that the rise of the creative class, I'm kind of poking fun at myself, but the rise of young people working in cool technologies, understanding they like urban areas, they kind of gave it a last gasp. This urban invasion, what other urbanists call youthification, the fact that well more than half the people who moved to urban centers were young people, yeah, that made sense. They moved and they took jobs there, and then pop, with COVID, that was over. So the whole idea of stacking and packing, I hated it. Like, the idea of working in a cubicle farm, shoot me. I mean, I don't even understand how we could have thought that was okay. So that was the death knell of that thing. And what's interesting, I went back, I have a lot of data because I have a lot of friends. I have a lot of friends at Gensler and other places. So downtown LA doesn't stack up terribly. And I thought it was going to do much worse. I mean, according to one recent study, you have 16% office vacancy down here, which is second lowest to Miami. There's another big study my friend Paul Levy did. It's a really good study. I wrote about it where David writes too at City Lab. He looked at what really makes downtowns go, and I'll tell you where you're challenged in a second. He looked at residents, he looked at commuter workers, and he looked at visitors. You have a big increase in residents. I mean, maybe you started with a low base, but 120%, so 20% more than before the pandemic, third best of any downtown in the country. Where you lag, of course, is people coming back to work, even though you have a low vacancy rate, not as many people have come back to work, and visitors. What we're finding is that really, if you want to think about the vibrancy of a downtown or a downtown business district, or what other people have called a central innovation district, a central social district, think about it, central entertainment district, a central recreational district, visitors matter. According to Paul's work, about 25% of activity in a downtown is workers, commuter workers, about 15% is residents, and about 60% is visitors. And it makes sense. There are other places to visit in LA, but it's something to think about. We were talking, Pete, when I did the big project on downtown Washington, I strongly urged them to make downtown Washington a great place for learning, think tanks, public policy schools, and also connect it to the visitor stuff that's going on the mall, which it's not connected to, and the cultural institutions that are there. Where I think downtowns matter is they are agglomerations of activities. I think I made a big mistake in my own work. One of the biggest mistakes is not identifying the creative class or any of that. It's the fact that I thought cities could be great places based on small-scale, tactical Jane Jacobs urbanisms with wonderful neighborhoods and coffee shops and all of that. I now think that for downtowns to survive, they need big-scale cultural institutions. They need entertainment. They need sports. It's maybe the right place to put the stuff, too, because it has good transport connections, it has good highway connections. I learned that I do a lot of work in Detroit. I gave a talk to the U.S. Hospitality Association last year, and they woke me up and they said, what can San Francisco learn from Detroit? And my mouth hit the ground. I never thought I'd hear that. And I said, well, in Detroit, they put the stadiums downtown because there was nothing else they could go there. And they put the arena downtown. And I held my nose, and I don't like casinos, and I put a casino downtown. But they created an entertainment district that brought people from the... Now, I'm not saying that's the only thing to do, but it's important. And I think what I've learned, and you don't just have one downtown. I think this is really important. That what we're seeing is a metropolitan area pockmarked with multiple downtowns. Some like downtown, your financial district, Century City. Some that are different, that are smaller. But what you're getting is this punctuated metropolis with different kind of nodal centers. Here's the way I like to think about it. When they ask people what they want in a great downtown, Gensler asked, restaurants, coffee shops, social venues, parks and open spaces, access to transit, shopping, theaters, musical performance spaces, museums and cultural venues, historical and cultural landmarks, all rated significantly higher than a place to work. What I think our communities are becoming, but especially our downtown, are centers of connectivity. I think this is really important. That when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class and I said why it makes our cities great places to live, work, and play, if I could do that over, I would put work, live, and play in small letters and connect. I call this connectivity districts, connectivity zones, central connectivity districts. That's what people are looking for. Places outside there, as the place we work declines relative in importance. When we separated our lives into these two containers and commuted, people are looking for, where this dawned in me, is when we went up to New York City in July, I believe it was 2021, and all the offices were black. And my buddy had a plane, he flew up there from Canada. And we walked around Midtown, and all the offices were dark, and about 4:45 we started to see these lineups that got longer and longer in front of every restaurant, bar, and cafe. There were no tourists. There were people like us coming in from parts of the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut to connect with one another. And we left the restaurant. It was like a Milos. We left the restaurant at like 10. People must have been there till midnight. They wanted to connect. We are humans. The other thing, of course, is that the other formation that's important is a megaregion. A megaregion is a constellation of metropolitan areas that creates scale. In order to be a great global city, I can't think of any great global cities that aren't megaregions. The New York, Boston, Washington, Cardiff's the most famous one, Greater London. You can go on and on about them. There are 40 of them. We identified them using satellite imagery. You know, this one in Southern California is non-trivial. 22 plus million people, 2 trillion in GDP, an economy that's as large as Spain, so you need scale, one of the 15 largest economies in the world. And I could talk a little bit about challenges. Maybe I'll just hang. I'll end on one more thing and then try to wrap up. I think that polycentrism is an important new characteristic of this new geography. I think that the megaregion is an important new characteristic, and it makes sense. When you're a megaregion, you need to have polycentric nodes and hubs. But I think there's a third thing that's emerging that's even bigger. That's the biggest change in geography in human history. I'm probably going to write a book on this. All technologies before digital enabled cities or metropolitan areas to expand physically. They basically, if you look at the census or any national census or the UN definition of human settlement, it's a shared labor market. In fact, if you look at research in the subject by economists, sometimes they use metropolitan areas, sometimes they use a thing called a commuting zone. Commuting zone. Digital technology allows cities to expand in a new way. And this is why this whole idea of remote versus not, New York versus Miami, or Miami versus New York. Miami's winning the war. Austin's stealing technology, people from San Francisco. Nashville's eating LA's lunch. Stupid. It's a network. We have a new global spatial division of labor, which is a network. The only way to understand Miami is as a digital hinterland of New York. The only way to understand Austin is it's part of the high-tech complex in San Francisco. The only way to understand Nashville, because I'm there all the time, and I was on the plane yesterday, it's part of the entertainment complex centered here. And what people don't understand is that these are, Mike Sorper said to me, Richard, you're just talking about peripheries, right? You're talking about peripheral growth. This is a digital periphery. It's a digital suburb. That is really interesting. And LA, you know, if San Francisco anchors the high-tech one, if New York and London anchor finance, insurance, and real estate ones, LA anchors the entertainment one, and you know, who's in that? Of course, Nashville. A little bit of New York, a little bit of the Bay Area, a little bit of Las Vegas, and other places, but you really need to think, I know I'm going to write a book on this, how you position yourself for success as a business, as an individual, because as an individual, this means a lot to your life, and how you do it as a city. So I think thinking about LA, and I think LA helps define that. Yes, you have some challenges. I have a whole thing, I just scratched it out. Affordability, although, you know, these new rise of the rest places that were supposed to be the be-all and end-all, boy, they caught up to you fast. I would argue to you, spending time in Miami Beach, it's more expensive than that. I think that it's well more expensive than in LA right now. And there's, the other thing you offer, too, is although you're spread out and schools are always hard, you also, as a region that has history to it, you have great institutions, a number of great universities, and you have good schools. The schools may be few and far, they may be far apart. People may have to drive a long distance. On the subject that you mentioned, congestion and transport, But, you know, I'd advise you to think new and different about this. I think in a digital world, in a world in hubs and satellites, it's not just about transit lines anymore. In fact, we've seen many of these transit lines, I'm being honest, in cities like Toronto or New York being underutilized. Maybe it's time to think differently about transit in a world that has digital connectivity, the ability to have differentiated schedules, that maybe you can encourage people to live a little close. I'm not trying to make people live. You encourage and develop structures that enable people to live a little closer to where they work, commute less frequently or smarter, make use of digital technology. So, you know, when I wrote my book, The Great Reset, I got criticized in the Financial Times because they said Florida believes mega regions need high-speed rail connections, but he also thinks people should bicycle. I don't think that's a criticism. I think that all works together. And what I think you should keep your eyes on is not the type of transportation. And don't make the wrong investments because they're expensive. One of the key things to making a great city is the speed and velocity of moving people, goods, and ideas. Right? If you really think at what's on the bottom of the metabolism of space or of location, it's the speed at which people can connect and collide with one another and move people, goods, and ideas, to really think about that. And of course, you have a huge, not just one, I did a study of this, I got another one in Toronto. I tried to make the case that Toronto should keep its island airport open. It has a small island airport in downtown that's incredible, connects to New York, Boston, Washington, Philadelphia. I think it should have jets, and people, they literally wanted to shoot me and run me out of town. They thought I was a heretic. I mean, like, Florida has lost its mind, which they're probably right. But what I did then was look at the importance of airports, and I wanted to find that airports were not important. You know, I really wanted to be a critic of Casarda. And I found Casarda was right, that having not an airport, of course LAX is great, having multiple airports that connect you to a global world. So it's not, of course there's a circulation of people within the metropolis, but I think on top of that there's the connective fiber. And one of the key things to competitive success is how you connect to places outside, somewhat connected by the digital world, but also connected by flights. So LAX and I forget, you had, I think it was 6 or 7. I counted them up. Should have written it down, but I didn't. There were quite a few airports. Look, this isn't the first time a major city has faced adversity, and it won't be the last. In many cases, though not all cases, cities have come back stronger from these disasters than before. The rebuilding from the fire is one part, but I think the Olympics are even more important. The Olympics even give you a bigger platform to do that. And I think what I said before, you need to really think about a governance system here that stops keeping people out and really welcomes people in. You know, a man's much smarter than me said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So don't waste it. Thanks for, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you, Pete.
And thank you, Richard. Those were great and challenging remarks. Maybe as a way of kicking it off, I was intrigued, Richard, by what you said about the governance structures and the fact that history has told us that in the past that it hasn't just been about necessarily rebuilding something new, although that tends to happen, but there is a looking at different governance and policy structures. We're going to explore some of those issues in the second panel, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, are there particular things in our governance or policy regime that you see as making it more difficult for people to come here, to be as welcoming?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stuff in the built environment that has inhibited growth, that, you know, I'm enough of a fan of a guy named Izzy Roman that says, you know, we've built a lot at the exurban fringe, and we've actually built a lot in the city. It's in those, like I drove to them, right, on the way down here from Beverly Hills. Like there's so many parts of this area that could be built up. And maybe not built up with skyscrapers, but built up. And I think Toronto, believe it or not, Toronto's doing a decent job of that. So a place, well, Arlington, Virginia has been lauded as a place that no one thought that could grow. I think figuring out how to make metropolitan governance work, I'm not an expert on this. And this is, I don't mean to come back and challenge you, Pete, in the public policy school. I think this is an area we haven't done enough research.
Yeah.
I've tried to look at this. There isn't, if you look at most public policy schools, and I was at the Kennedy School, and I was at Carnegie Mellon School of Urban, now School of Management, I was at George Mason. Most of those schools had kind of a national and international agenda. Urbanism was a little runt, not in your school, but a little thing. There were 2 people in it, 3 people in it. It often had a diversity angle to it. Many times it had an ideological angle to it. But there weren't many people studying governance, local, state. And I think what's cool about it, it's the federalism. How do we use federalism better? I don't know, we got this cool tool, so I'm not an expert in it, but in California now, I think you have an opportunity with the state. I think giving more power. One of the things we know is that people really don't, and I don't care if you like Trump or Biden. People ask me about Canada. They say, what do people think of Trudeau? I think take all the people who don't like Trump and all the people who don't like Biden, add them up, and you got all the people who don't like Trudeau. So that's just. But I think at the federal level, a lot of people are disgruntled, with the federal government. The state, it tends to be 50-50, maybe because half the state, one that's local, 85% of people express real faith and confidence.
Yeah.
And so maybe thinking about that a little better. And then I think, Howard was saying the NIMBY-YIMBY and the way it cuts. I thought that was brilliant what you were saying to me. But not so much just NIMBY-YIMBY. How do you make an environment that welcomes people to start businesses, build homes, gets it done fast? And then of course, I would be remiss not to say this, schools. How do you make sure that, particularly in cities, people have access to good schools? And then, of course, dealing with the issues of not just crime and violence, but all of the things that are perceptions of crime and violence. Those would seem to be the elements.
Let's open up for questions. Do we have questions from the
Anything.
audience?
And you can tell me I'm full of beans.
Yeah. Howard.
You were saying privately that you and your organization don't want to be ideological, and you kind of abhor this polarization. But when all the innovation is being concentrated in a very few areas, and not kind of evenly democratically spread across the country, how do you avoid radical polarization?
Well, I think that there are other parts of the country that can do different things. And I'm doing a lot of work. I'm a fellow at Heartland Forward. I'm doing a tremendous amount of work in Michigan. I just finished a report for the state of Michigan and another for Detroit, which I'll mention. I think what California and these places do well, I wrote a book about this in 1993, Pete.
Of course.
Called The Breakthrough Illusion, is the places in California and Boston and Austin and Seattle make breakthrough innovations. They create those new big revolutionary Schumpeterian technologies. What we don't do very well in the United States, what Japan does better, Korea does better, Taiwan does better, China does better, parts of Europe do better, is apply those technologies to incumbent industries. And the point I made for Michigan and Detroit is that's what they can do. And what I was saying is with the AI and computer science capability of the University of Michigan, combined with the incumbent industry, so I think in those parts of the world, I don't see them replicating Los Angeles or Silicon Valley. I see them being places that can apply, and if you apply, you can develop very good jobs. Those are the industries that develop very good jobs. So that's what I would think, the application. And I do think that is starting to happen. I think it was happening under Biden with fiscal policy. I don't like the tariffs at all, and hopefully they won't stick. But I think under Trump it's happening in a different way, right? So I think regardless of our political polarization, there is this increasing emphasis on thinking about how to reshore and rebuild our industries. I think that could be a good thing. Maybe though, LA is still a big manufacturing economy. Maybe the thing to think about is how do you kind of shift some of that? I'm not trying to get rid of it. Are there better locations for some of the heavy stuff that could be better done in a lower cost location? So thinking very much about the spatial division of labor. By the way, I don't like the polarization. I don't like the ideology in my field. I think my field has become far too ideological. I think the right place to have this conversation is public policy schools and business schools. I think we have the right degrees, and what I would love to see and to train new professionals is new professional degrees what is your degree called? Is it MPP?
It's an MPP.
Yeah. MPPs and MBAs focused on urban innovation and maybe real estate development is not the right term. Professional degrees in this space which link understanding, and maybe urban's wrong because so much of what we have to do is suburban. I can't think of the right word. But I think the professional degrees in the public policy schools and the business schools are the right degrees to equip people for this future.
Over here. Yep.
Thank you. So what I really appreciate about your thinking is how abundant it is. And I'm wondering if what you could share from your research when there are constraints or threats. So thinking about to the examples you gave at the beginning, the innovations that followed catastrophes, which is historically demonstrated, we are now in a position where we have multiple constraints or threats facing this mega region, and I'd name three. One might be the overextended public purse, yes. Right? All of our municipalities are facing tremendous financial pressures, which have only been made worse. A challenge to labor in the form of crackdowns on immigration and other things. And then in the diffuse civic environment of Los Angeles, I would characterize the mega events play as one sector biting off more than maybe the other sectors can chew. So what would you recommend to us in this mega region in terms of dealing with constant constraints or outside threats as we try to achieve what you've prescribed?
So I don't know enough about the specifics, but what I would say, knowing people who've written on California, that your last point is very apt. That LA has never been as organized as greater LA as it might be. So that would seem to be a first step. Trying to organize regional mechanisms, regional civic mechanisms, constellations of mechanisms that allow, I think, of course, overcoming the ideology that infests so much of this field and being very pragmatic, especially in a resource-constrained environment. You can't solve every problem, but you better solve the really important ones. And what I found in urban affairs is we often get distracted into very they're important, but they're marginal to this effort. So staying very focused. What we found over the history of innovation is that in times of crisis, innovations just bunch up and stay on the sidelines. The people who followed Schumpeter as the great students of innovation found this, that even if they looked at patents or commercial innovations, they would bunch up until some of these constraints were alleviated, and then they would burst forward. So I don't know the particular answer, but I think that's where crises help. They open the door. The stuff is bunching up. It's bunching up now, innovations in building construction, modular construction, new technologies in construction, urban innovation, property technology, but it's just staying on the sidelines. And maybe thinking of ways to unlock that, and small demonstration programs where you can show its efficacy. But I'd love to work more with you guys on that.
Question?
Mr. Florida, thank you for speaking to us today. About 15 years ago, I was a grad student, and I had read your research on the rise of the creative class, and you had listed the most creative cities in the United States, and Los Angeles didn't figure among that group. So I'm curious, now, you seem to be a great evangelist for LA. What has changed, your understanding of the soul of LA or LA itself?
Well, I haven't really looked at those are crude. I mean, they're just an overall ranking, like the same as a ranking of people with a bachelor's degree and above. I think what's really changed and what I've learned a lot about is the importance not just of the information industries, but of the entertainment industries in this world. And yeah, that's where you really have an enormous advantage in not just entertainment, but entertainment fused with digital, and you have scale. So I'd say that's where I think you are very uniquely positioned. And I would encourage you to take a big-time advantage of that.
Got time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. You just mentioned about the role of the business professionals and the public policy professionals, and I was just curious if you could touch upon urban health as an emerging innovative ideas and the focus of public health as a driving force and those people in the room as well.
Yeah, I want to say two things. A long time ago, I did a big project interviewing venture capitalists, and of course didn't tape the interviews, just wrote them down in a notebook. And I was talking, I'm even forgetting his name. There was a fellow in Pittsburgh and a fellow in Cleveland. Margaret O'Mara's book talks about both of them, but there were about 100 when I wrote, this was in the 1980s. They were very advanced age then. What the one in Cleveland said to me is, you know, I've made all this money investing in information technology. And it was an incredible amount of money to be made then. But if I had to do it over, I would be investing in biotech and health. And I said, why? He said, well, people are willing to spend anything on that, on health. And that always lingered in the back of my mind. And then I think about today's environment. And not, you know, I sometimes I call this California culture. Health and wellness. Like, nobody gave a shit about this when I was young at all. And now it's all, other than where people live and what they're doing with their house, they don't talk about their fancy cars anymore. They talk about, I'm riding my bike 16 hours a day, or I'm doing this workout, or I'm lifting weights. And so it's health and wellness. And I think also for moves, both with, and I don't want to say for everyone, but certainly for people who are empty nesters or retirees, and for people with families, access to health care means I can tell you, because I live in Canada, the thing that would most make us move back to the States in this is healthcare. Access to quality healthcare and the ability to get healthcare on demand combined with wellness, yeah, and I think it's a big change. What I wanted to say, just to close, I think you have enormous opportunity at Pepperdine. I didn't want to miss this. We started, I didn't want to miss it. What I'm trying to do at Vanderbilt, because we have a very interesting chancellor there, who's very provocative, like you, opening campuses outside of the home base and in growth markets, like you, wants to have an open-minded conversation, the university to be institutionally neutral. But what we're trying to do there, and we haven't figured this out, is equip students to navigate this new world of how we live and work. So on the one hand, we would try, and we don't have a public policy school, you probably know that. Yep. We have an MBA school, so maybe it would start in the MBA school. We're going to start to try to build those concentrations. We have a good healthcare. Maybe urban health, like you said, would be another area. And you know, the thing about walking, how important the layout of an environment. I think the real challenge is to equip every undergraduate. Every single Pepperdine student should be exposed to this. And look, if you think about it, what are we equipping kids with? Well, how do they get education and get a job? That was great for 1950. I think we should be giving kids the ability to think about not only to have a great job, but like, what kind of life do I want to lead? Where do I want to lead it? Where do I have to go to be in this industry? How do I have to navigate that and understand not only going to the career office for a job, but how do I navigate this world of different places? So yeah, I think both things, not only the new professional degrees, but giving young people, you're really smart undergrads, this. Anyway, if anyone wants to contact me, I'll hang around for a while. My email is florida@creativeclass.com. That's pretty easy to remember. And I read and I respond to all of them. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, everybody, for inviting me here. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Please join me in thanking Richard.